how much Australia needs to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. That's if we're going to help the global effort to stave off dangerous increases in temperature. Now, this week, a government body, the Climate Change Authority, said that the current bipartisan position of reducing our emissions by 5% by 2020, well, it's the equivalent of fiddling while Rome burns. It will do nothing. If we really wanted to do something about climate change, according to the authority, we need to cut our carbon pollution by at least 25% by 2020. Importantly, the authority says that the current coalition policy of direct action will not get us to that target. Now, here at Sunday Extra, what we want to know is what exactly do we need to do to reduce those emissions beyond that figure? What's the reality? And how do we measure that what we are doing is making a significant difference? Now, to look at that and other seemingly simple but probably quite complex questions, we're joined by Economist Dr. Richard Dennis, Director of the Canberra-based think tank, the Australia Institute. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
They're just numbers, aren't they? 25%, 5%, 2020, all of these things. When we're talking about reducing our emissions by those numbers, it's a percentage of what?
Well, we're usually talking, well, in Australia, and we often use different baselines to other countries, but most countries refer to reducing emissions below 1990 levels, but increasingly we talk about 2000 levels. So yeah, we're talking about a percentage reduction from historic levels, and in Australia we're talking about 2000 levels, but there's unfortunately a bit of confusion around there because different people in different countries can't even agree on where the starting point is, where the baseline is.
And of course it's a thing for the world, not just for us. I mean, that criticism is made often, that what are we talking about when everybody else needs to do it too, however.
Yeah, but I guess there's a very simple point that I always make, and that is if emissions are growing, we're failing. It's really not hard to figure out whether we're failing or not, because our emissions continue to rise, our energy use continues to rise, we're burning more coal, we're burning more petrol. So yes, it's very important to talk about emission reductions. That's what we need to get to, but let's be really clear, they're growing, and if they're growing, we're failing.
And when we do talk about it, more often than not, we talk about this of a percentage cut figure. So let's look at that thing of 25%, as discussed by the Climate Change Authority in this past week. A 25% cut, what exactly does that mean?
Well, again, we've got to talk about the time period. We're talking about time periods for 2020, which are 7 years away, and we're talking about either using less fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are obviously a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking about generating less methane and other climate change causing gases. We get a lot of methane production in agriculture and from the mining sector. And we're talking about reducing the amount of trees that we cut down and land that we clear, because when we chop down trees have spent hundreds, sometimes thousands of years taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it as wood. Now, when we chop that wood down and burn it or turn it into paper, we put a lot of that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we either have to use less fuel, use less fossil fuels, produce less methane from agriculture and mining processes, or chop down fewer trees and in turn free up less of that carbon that's stored in the wood itself.
And I mean, it's around those things like trees, I guess, is where it starts to get sort of kind of complex and intriguing, and especially when we talk about the potential of trading entities like the carbon locked in those natural resources and so on. That then starts to become quite a complex set of ideas.
Look, sadly, governments and proponents of tackling climate change and opponents of tackling climate change have all succeeded in making this far more complex than it needs to be. But you're right. When we start to talk about emissions trading, another way for Australia to, quote, reduce, and I've got my little fingers up in the air saying reduce here.
I saw that.
Another way for us to reduce our emissions is to simply pay another country to reduce, with my fingers in the air, their emissions. And that's where international emissions trading comes in. That rather than Australia burn less coal, burn less oil, or release as much methane from mining as it does, rather than us actually change anything here within our own borders, another possibility is that we pay another country to reduce their emissions. And often you'll find that the credits that we can buy from those countries do come from reductions in their forestry activity, for example.
You can see the temptations of that sort of approach, allowing us to dig up and burn coal while still reducing the amount of carbon we might release into the environment. But
yes, but the problem is somebody around the world has to do a lot of reducing. And the problem with emissions trading, the political problem with emissions trading, is that it allows all countries to pretend that some other country will actually do the reducing while we get on with the important task of polluting. Well, if we're going to have a global response to climate change, I would suggest that countries like Australia need to get serious about burning fewer fossil fuels and chopping down so many trees. And let's face it, Australia has a larger share of the world coal market than the Saudi-Arabians have of the world oil market, and we're planning to double our coal exports. So we're betting billions of dollars that the world isn't very serious about tackling climate change. Why else would we double the number of coal mines we're building?
Richard Dennis is from the Australia Institute. We're talking carbon targets, and Richard, the figure we have in mind is 25%. So take us forward to 2020. We've made that 25% reduction, let's theorise, in our emissions. What has that done to our economy?
Well, not very much. Not very much at all. Now let's be clear. This is a recommendation that Australia needs to reduce emissions by at least 25%. The Labor Party and the Liberal Party currently agree it only needs to be 5%, which completely ignores the science. Indeed, 25% is at the low end. You're probably looking at least 30% if we're taking the science seriously. But if Australia's going to be more ambitious than it currently intends to be, an economy that's polluting 25% less than it currently is will be an economy that's no longer subsidising forestry. At the moment, taxpayers spend a fortune to encourage the chopping down of large numbers of trees in places like Tasmania, to a lesser extent Victoria and New South Wales. So the taxpayer is actually paying a lot of money to make sure that we release a lot of emissions from forestry. And it's a big if, but if we were serious about reducing emissions, we could save ourselves a lot of money in those subsidies to the forestry industry and in turn pollute a lot less. We need to not just continue to invest in renewable energy, which is very important, but we need to do something simpler and far more profitable, and that's start to take energy efficiency seriously. Now, anyone that believes that corporations will do anything to make a buck need only drive through the CBD at night time to see them wasting all that money lighting empty office buildings. Now, that's just the most visible part of the waste. Mm-hmm. But Australia wastes an enormous amount of energy. We waste enormous amounts of energy in our home. There are more homes with air conditioners than there are with insulation in their roofs. We waste enormous amounts of energy in our office buildings. Often office buildings simultaneously have heaters and chillers running in their basements working against each other. And we waste huge amounts of energy in our factories. So energy efficiency alone won't tackle climate change, but the low-hanging fruit, the actual profitable things that we can do to tackle climate change, like ending the subsidies to forestry, ending the subsidies for fossil fuel use, and encouraging or even requiring energy efficiency will get us a long way towards far more ambitious targets than 5%.
Well, which is reassuring that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to be plucked in a way. And as you suggested too, Richard Dennis, that notion of a 25% target by 2020, there's reports out there which suggest that that's not even really in the ballpark. So we ought to be considerably more ambitious.
Well, we should, and let's be really clear. Whether we're talking 5% or 25%, we're pretty much ignoring the science there. The science says that Australia needs to start with something more like around a 30% emission reduction to have some sort of fair share.
The science would suggest about 100% cut by the end of the century, wouldn't it?
Well, we're talking here about having some chance of only 2 degrees of warming. Now, 2 degrees of warming is a very, very scary, unknown thing. So, yes, look, there's no doubt we've already started to warm the planet. And if, and again, this is a big if, and I don't believe it, but if we were really serious about wanting to avoid climate change, then yes, we'd be going far further, far faster. But we abandoned that. We abandoned avoiding climate change many years ago. We're now trying to limit the amount of climate change that we're willing to accept to only 2 degrees, which again, the scientists are sort of saying, well, where'd you get only 2 degrees from? That looks pretty scary to us. But at a political level, we've kind of agreed that 2 degrees of climate change is enough pain that we're willing to take. So 30% is kind of a fair share, in inverted commas, of what Australia would need to do. But again, these are minimum numbers. So yeah, the debate has really abandoned science. We just had a federal election where both major parties went to the election talking about policy instruments like carbon taxes and emissions trading and direct action. We're having a big, passionate, very exciting political debate about the policy instrument, and there's virtually no public debate about the actual target itself.
Perhaps that will come. Richard Dennis, thanks so much for your time this morning. It's a grim picture, but as you say, there is low-hanging fruit. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's only grim if we ignore it.
Economist Richard Dennis, he's director of the Canberra-based think tank, the Australia Institute. It's 22 minutes away from 10. Sunday Extra. Jonathan Green with you.
Okay, that was nice, wasn't it?